I slammed my laptop shut so hard the plastic creaked, my hands shaking and my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were just gone, vanished into thin air like smoke in a windstorm. I had spent the last 3 hours digging through digital folders I wasn't even supposed to have access to, and what I found made my blood run cold. There were transfers to offshore accounts, payments to companies I had never heard of, and massive withdrawals that happened while I was busy grocery shopping or tucking our kids into bed. My husband, Julian, was the man I had trusted with every single secret of my life for over a decade. We were in the middle of a messy divorce, but I never imagined he would sink this low. He wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to erase our entire financial history, so I would be left with absolutely nothing. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. As I sat there in the dark living room, the front door opened and Julian walked in, looking as smug as ever. He didn't even look guilty when he saw me sitting there with the laptop. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his arms, and let out a cold, mocking laugh. He looked me right in the eye and said, "Go ahead and look, Frankie. You'll never find it all. I'm 10 steps ahead of you, and by the time this is over, you'll be lucky if you can afford a bus ticket out of town." My name is Frankie Tate, and in that exact moment I realized my life was a lie. What the hell just happened to me? I wasn't just losing a husband. I was fighting a monster who had been planning my downfall right under my nose for years. I tried to speak, but the words felt like they were stuck in my throat, dry and bitter. The betrayal tasted like metal in my mouth, sharp and cold. Every single lie he had told over the last year, every time he said he was working late or that the market was down, suddenly clicked into place like pieces of a dark puzzle. The life I thought we shared, the vacations, the laughs, and the quiet mornings, had all been a carefully crafted illusion designed to keep me distracted while he moved the pieces of our life away from me. I looked at the man standing in front of me and realized I didn't recognize him at all. He wasn't the person I married. He was a stranger wearing my husband's face. The anger began to burn deep in my chest, a hot flame that started to push away the cold fear. How could someone be so cruel to the person they once promised to protect forever? I couldn't believe he could do this to me, but even worse, I couldn't believe I had been so blind. I had trusted him with everything, including my bank passwords and my future security. Beneath the burning anger, a new kind of fear started to crawl up my spine. If he was bold enough to smirk about stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars, what else was he hiding? Was the house even safe? Were the college funds for the kids still there? My mind raced through 1,000 terrible possibilities, each one worse than the last. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. I had to do something, but I felt paralyzed by the sheer scale of his deception. I was a stay-at-home mom with no income of my own, and he held all the keys to the kingdom. The minute Julian left the room, I grabbed my phone and called my closest friend, Chloe, my voice coming out in a broken whisper. Tears were finally streaming down my face, hot and fast, as I paced the small hallway. "He's hiding money, Chloe. All of it. He lied about every single penny we earned together." I sobbed into the receiver. I told her about the smirk on his face, and the way he talked to me like I was a bug he was about to squash under his shoe. I felt so small and defeated, like I had already lost the war before I even knew it had started. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a second before Chloe's voice cracked through the phone with pure, unfiltered outrage. She didn't tell me to calm down or pray about it. She told me exactly what I needed to hear in that moment of total darkness. "Frankie, listen to me right now," Chloe said, her voice firm and steady. "You have to fight back. This isn't just about money, it's about your life and your dignity. Do not let him get away with this. He thinks you're weak because you're kind, but he has no idea who he's dealing with." For the first time in hours, the shaking in my hands started to stop. Her words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone in this nightmare, and that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward through the woods. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman with a choice to make. I could either sit in the dark and cry while he took everything, or I could stand up and start looking for a way to take my power back. Late at night, while the rest of the world was sleeping, I sat at my small kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee and a mountain of old bank statements. The yellow light of the lamp cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, making me feel even more isolated. I began to look at the numbers not as money, but as footprints in the snow. I noticed a weird pattern that I had never seen before. Every second Tuesday of the month, exactly $3,000 left our joint account and went into a mysterious holding company called Golden Oak Ventures. I searched through my memory trying to think if Julian had ever mentioned that name, but there was nothing. It was a ghost company, a hollow shell designed to catch money and hide it from the light. My heart started to race again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the thrill of the hunt. I was starting to see the strings he was pulling behind the scenes. I pulled out a red pen and started circling every transaction that looked suspicious. By the time the sun began to peek through the blinds, the papers were covered in red marks. It looked like a crime scene, which was fitting because that is exactly what it was. Julian had been siphoning off our savings for over 3 years, long before he even mentioned the word divorce. He had been planning his exit strategy while we were still picking out paint colors for the hallway. The calculation of his cruelty was staggering. He didn't just want a new life. He wanted to make sure I couldn't have one. But as I stared at the Golden Oak entries, I realized he had made a mistake. He thought I was too distracted by the kids and the house to ever look at the fine print. He thought I was soft. He was wrong. The next morning, I confronted Julian in the kitchen while he was pouring his expensive orange juice. I didn't yell or scream like I wanted to. Instead, I kept my voice as cold and flat as a frozen lake. I slid a copy of the Golden Oak Statement across the granite island and watched his face. For a split second, his eyes widened and the glass in his hand trembled just a tiny bit. It was the first time I had ever seen a crack in his perfect polished armor. I felt a surge of power that I hadn't felt in years. "What is Golden Oak Ventures, Julian?" I asked, leaning forward. "And why has it been eating our children's future for the last 36 months? The silence in the kitchen was so heavy it felt like it might crush the floorboards. I waited, my eyes locked onto his, refusing to be the first one to blink. Julian recovered quickly, his face twisting into a mask of annoyed boredom. He pushed the paper back toward me with a flick of his finger. "It's a private investment, Frankie. Something you wouldn't understand with your little mom brain. It's perfectly legal and none of your business." He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me, his shadow falling over my face. "If you keep digging into things that don't concern you, this divorce is going to get very ugly very fast. You're lucky I'm even offering you the house. Don't be ungrateful." He walked out of the room, leaving the scent of his expensive cologne hanging in the air like a threat. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness. I was shaking with the absolute certainty that I was going to take him down. He thought he could bully me into silence, but he had just given me more fuel for the fire. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Julian was a high-level executive who understood the dark corners of the financial world, and I was just a woman with a red pen and a laptop. That afternoon, I walked into a sleek office building downtown to meet with a forensic accountant named Marcus Vance. Chloe had found him for me, telling me he was the best at finding money that people didn't want found. Marcus was a quiet man with sharp eyes and a very serious suit. I laid out my red-circled papers on his desk and told him everything: the Golden Oak transfers, Julian's threats, and the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars. I felt embarrassed to admit how much I had missed over the years, but Marcus didn't judge me. He looked at the papers for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Marcus finally looked up, he didn't look worried. He looked impressed. "Mr. Tate has been very busy," Marcus said, tapping the Golden Oak document. "But he's also been very arrogant. He left a trail because he didn't think anyone would bother to follow it. This isn't just a simple investment, Frankie. This is a classic shell game." He explained that Julian was likely using these companies to buy assets like real estate or stocks under different names. Marcus told me that if we could prove the money came from our joint marital funds, the court would force Julian to give it all back, and maybe even more as a penalty for hiding it. For the first time since the divorce started, I felt a glimmer of real hope. I wasn't just guessing anymore. I had a professional on my side, and we were about to start digging into the truth. I met Chloe at a small, out-of-the-way diner where the air smelled like grease and old coffee. I chose this place because I knew Julian would never step foot in a building that didn't have a valet. My hands were finally steady as I spread my initial findings across the sticky table. Chloe gasped as she looked at the red circles on the bank statements, her eyes wide with shock. "Frankie, this isn't just a little bit of money," she whispered, leaning in close so the couple at the next booth wouldn't hear. "This is a fortune. He's been moving money into these accounts for years. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to leave you completely penniless while he lived like a king." Seeing the truth reflected in her eyes made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't just my imagination or my mom brain being paranoid. It was a cold, calculated crime. Chloe grabbed my hand and her grip was like iron. "You have to keep this secret for now," she warned. "If Julian knows you're onto him, he'll just move the money again or delete the digital trails. You have to play the part of the sad, defeated wife a little while longer." I hated the idea of pretending to be weak, but I knew she was right. I had to be a silent hunter. We spent the next hour planning how I would act at home. I would stop asking questions about the money. I would stop looking at the bank statements when he was around. I would let him believe he had already won. As I left the diner, I felt a strange sense of calm. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Julian had no idea that I was already steps ahead. Living in the same house as Julian while knowing the truth was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every time he walked into a room, I felt like I was holding a live wire. He was so confident in his victory that he started being kind, in a way that felt like a slap in the face. He would offer to pay for a cheap apartment for me or tell me he'd let me keep the old minivan as a favor. I had to bite my tongue so hard I could taste blood just to keep from screaming the truth at him. At dinner, I kept my head down and pretended to be worried about how I would pay the light bills. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, seeing the smug satisfaction on his face. He actually enjoyed seeing me struggle. It made him feel powerful. The most disgusting part was watching him pretend to be a victim to our neighbors and friends. He would sigh and tell people how difficult the divorce was and how he was doing his best to take care of me despite everything. I heard him on the phone one night, laughing with a friend about how I was finally seeing reality. I knew that his reality was a lie he had manufactured to keep the lion's share of our life. I immediately wrote down the names of people he talked to. I was a spy in my own home, gathering evidence while I served dinner and folded laundry. Every lie he told was just another nail in the coffin I was building for his reputation. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a witness to a crime, and I was recording every single second of it in my mind. A few days later, I finally sat down with a professional who could help me bridge the gaps. We looked at the golden oak transfers and the weird patterns I had found. It wasn't just the shell companies. Julian had been using a series of fake invoices from a construction company that didn't exist. He was paying for renovations on our house that were never actually done. The money was being funneled into a private trust fund in a different state. "Frankie, this is more than just hiding assets," I realized as I looked at the signatures. "This is fraud. He's been signing my name on some of these documents." I felt a chill run down my spine. He hadn't just stolen our money. He had used my name to do it. The betrayal went deeper than I ever imagined. I knew I needed one more thing to bridge the gap: Julian's private ledger. I suspected Julian kept a physical backup of his real numbers somewhere safe because he didn't trust technology entirely. I knew exactly where it was. Julian had a small fireproof safe in the back of his closet that he told me only held boring tax papers. I had never thought to look in it because I trusted him. That night, while Julian was out at a celebratory dinner with his coworkers, I stood in front of that closet with a heavy heart. My hands were shaking as I tried the combinations I knew: the kids' birthdays, our anniversary, his old jersey number. None of them worked. Then I tried the date he started his new company, the day I thought our future was beginning. The lock clicked open. Inside wasn't just a ledger. It was the entire map of his deception. I stared at the leather-bound ledger inside the safe, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. While Julian was out at his fancy dinner, I sat on the closet floor and flipped through the pages. It wasn't just numbers. It was a diary of greed. He had listed every offshore account, every consulting fee he had paid to himself, and even the names of the people who helped him move the money. He had been planning this since before our 10th anniversary. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I saw a note in the margin that said, Frankie won't notice the missing $50,000. She never checks the equity line. He had used my trust as a weapon against me. I didn't cry this time. I took my phone and photographed every single page, making sure the flash didn't reflect off the paper. The more I read, the more I realized how much he underestimated me. He thought I was just a part of the furniture, someone who kept the house clean and the kids fed while he ran the world. He didn't realize that I was the one who managed the household budget for a decade on a stipend he gave me. I knew how to make a dollar stretch, and I knew how to spot a lie. I sent the photos to Marcus immediately through an encrypted app we had set up. "I found the map," I texted. My hands were finally still. I put the ledger back exactly how I found it, closed the safe and walked out of the room. When Julian came home smelling like expensive steak and wine, I gave him a tired, defeated smile. I was the best actress in the world that night. The next day, Marcus called me into his office. He looked like he hadn't slept, but his eyes were bright with excitement. "Frankie, the ledger you found is the missing piece of the puzzle," he said, pointing to a large flowchart on his wall. "We tracked the consulting fees to a bank in the Cayman Islands. But here is the best part. Julian didn't just hide the money. He tried to claim it as a business loss on your joint tax returns." My jaw dropped. That meant he hadn't just stolen from me. He had involved me in tax fraud without my knowledge. If the IRS found out, I could be in just as much trouble as he was. The stakes had just jumped from a messy divorce to potential prison time. Marcus explained that because I was the one who brought the evidence forward, we could seek innocent spouse relief, but we had to act fast. We needed to file a motion with the court to freeze all his known accounts before he could move the money again. "He's going to realize the net is closing in," Marcus warned. "Once we file this, he will know you've been digging. You need to be prepared for the fallout." I nodded, feeling a cold resolve settle over me. I wasn't afraid of his anger anymore. I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't stop him. I gave Marcus the green light to proceed. The quiet war was over. From here on out, it was going to be a public battle, and I was ready to stand my ground. That evening, Julian walked into the house and immediately knew something was wrong. Maybe it was the way I didn't look away when he glared at me, or the way I was sitting at the dining room table with a stack of legal documents instead of a laundry basket. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. I didn't say a word. I just slid the court order freezing his accounts across the table. I watched his face go from confusion to realization, and finally to a deep dark purple rage. He grabbed the paper and ripped it in half, but it didn't matter. The bank had already received the digital copy. He was locked out of his own game. "You think you're smart?" he hissed, leaning over the table until he was inches from my face. "You just ruined your own life, Frankie. Where do you think the money for this house comes from? Where do you think your allowance comes from? You've just cut off the hand that feeds you." I stood up slowly, matching his height. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. "That hand was stealing from my children's future, Julian," I said clearly. "I'd rather eat dirt than take another cent of stolen money from you." The look of pure shock on his face was better than any jewelry he had ever bought me. The power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the provider anymore. He was a defendant. And I was no longer his victim. Julian didn't speak to me for 3 days after the accounts were frozen. He moved into the guest room, and the house felt like a graveyard. Every time we passed each other in the hallway, the air felt thick with things unsaid. I spent my time organizing every photo I took of the ledger and sending them to my lawyer. I knew that Julian was a man who hated losing more than anything else. He wasn't just sitting in that guest room pouting. He was planning his next move. I made sure to change the locks on my phone and kept my laptop with me at all times. I even started sleeping with my door locked because the silence was more terrifying than his shouting had ever been. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a massive storm hits. On the 4th day, I noticed something strange. Julian was suddenly very busy on his phone, smiling and nodding as if he had just won the lottery. He started dressing in his best suits again, whistling while he made coffee in the morning. He acted like the court order didn't even exist. "You think you've won, Frankie," he said one morning, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "But you forgot one thing. Evidence is only good if people believe it. And in this town, people believe me." He walked out the door, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. What did he have up his sleeve? I called Rachel and told her that something was shifting. We had the numbers, but Julian had the reputation. I realized that the legal battle was only half the fight. I had to prepare for a war of words. The rumors started hitting my phone by lunchtime. My neighborhood group chat was buzzing with concerns about my mental health. Julian had apparently been telling everyone that the divorce was happening because I had lost my grip on reality and was imagining hidden millions to cope with my own spending habits. He told our friends that I had become obsessed with conspiracy theories and that he was heartbroken to see me break down like this. I sat on my sofa reading message after message from people asking if I needed professional help or a quiet place to rest. It was a classic move. He was trying to discredit me before I could ever present the forensic evidence to our social circle. He wanted me to look like a scorned, crazy wife, so no one would listen to the truth. I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I remembered what Marcus told me. Stay calm and let the evidence speak. I didn't reply to a single message. Instead, I started a new file on my computer titled, The Rebuttal. I realized that Julian's arrogance was his biggest weakness. He thought he could lie his way out of a paper trail. Every time he told a neighbor a lie, I matched it with a specific page from the ledger. If he said I was crazy for thinking he had a Cayman account, I had the wire transfer receipt ready. He was building a house of cards, and I was just waiting for the right moment to blow it all down. I spent the evening blocked out the world, focusing only on the facts. I wasn't going to fight his lies with more lies. I was going to fight them with the cold, hard truth. The big test came when Julian's family invited us to a mediation dinner at his parents' house. They were all on his side, looking at me with pity and judgment as I walked through the door. His sister, who always looked down on me, didn't even say hello. The table was set with the fine china, but the atmosphere was as cold as ice. Julian sat at the head of the table, looking like a king who had already won his kingdom back. "Frankie," his father said, clearing his throat, "we think it's best if you drop this ridiculous accounting investigation. It's embarrassing for the family, and it's clearly taking a toll on your mind. Just take the settlement Julian offered and move on quietly." They all nodded in agreement, staring at me like I was a child throwing a tantrum. I took a slow sip of water and looked around the room. I saw the smugness on Julian's face and the disdain in his sister's eyes. They thought I was trapped. They thought they could pressure me into silence with family loyalty. I reached into my bag and pulled out several folders, placing one in front of every person at the table. "I'm not here to argue," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm here to show you exactly what Julian has been doing with your family's name." I opened the first folder to the page where Julian had siphoned money from his own father's investment fund to fuel his shell companies. The room went dead silent as his father's face turned from judgmental to pale. The trap was set, and for the first time Julian looked genuinely terrified. The silence in the dining room was so heavy I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Julian's father stared at the bank statement, his face turning a ghostly shade of white as he realized his own son had been treating his retirement fund like a personal piggy bank. Julian reached across the table, his hand trembling as he tried to grab the folder, but his father slapped his hand away with a sharp crack that echoed against the high ceilings. "Is this true, Julian?" his father whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of shock and pure disappointment. Julian opened his mouth to lie, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal, but the numbers on the page were too clear to argue with. He looked at me, and for the first time I didn't see a powerful executive. I saw a small, desperate boy who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I sat there calmly, finishing my glass of water while the family I thought had hated me began to turn on each other. His sister started crying, not out of sadness for me, but because she realized the money for her dream wedding was actually stolen from their own father. The staged execution Julian had planned for me had completely backfired, and he was the one facing the firing squad of his family's judgment. I didn't feel happy, but I felt a deep sense of relief. The truth was finally out in the open, and it was doing the work that my tears never could. I stood up, tucked my chair in neatly, and walked toward the door. "I'll leave you all to discuss the family business," I said quietly. As I drove home, I realized that Julian's web of lies was finally unraveling, and he was the one getting tangled in the sticky threads. 2 hours after I got home, I heard Julian's car screech into the driveway. He didn't walk through the front door. He burst through it, his tie loosened and his hair a mess. He looked like he had been running for miles. He didn't come at me with anger this time. Instead, he dropped to his knees in the middle of the kitchen. "Frankie, please," he sobbed, reaching out toward my hem. "I'll give it all back. Every penny. Just tell my father it was a mistake. Tell the court you were wrong about the fraud." He looked pathetic, a shell of the man who had smirked at me and told me I'd never find the money. He was begging for mercy from the same woman he had called ungrateful and crazy just a few days ago. The shift was so dramatic it almost made me feel dizzy. I looked down at him and realized that his love had always been tied to his power. Now that his power was gone, he didn't know how to exist. He wasn't sorry for what he did to me. He was sorry that he got caught and that his reputation was in tatters. I stepped back out of his reach and crossed my arms. "It's too late for mistakes, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the marble counters. "You didn't just hide assets. You tried to destroy my life and steal from your own blood. You signed my name on those tax documents. That's a choice, not a mistake." He stayed on the floor, weeping into his hands, while I went upstairs to finish packing my bag. I was done being the person who absorbed his chaos. I was moving to a hotel, and I wasn't leaving a forwarding address. The next morning, Marcus and my lawyer met me at the courthouse to file the final evidence for the divorce hearing. Word of the dinner disaster had spread through the family and reached the ears of several business associates. Julian's world was collapsing in real time. We received word that his firm was starting an internal audit because if he was willing to steal from his family, they feared he was stealing from the company too. The forensic accounting report was now over 200 pages long. A massive mountain of proof that documented every single lie he had told over the last 3 years. Marcus smiled at me, a rare expression on his serious face. "He's teetering, Frankie," Marcus said. "He has no allies left, and no way to hide the truth anymore. We have him exactly where we want him." I felt a strange sense of anticipation as we walked into the judge's chambers. I wasn't shaking with fear anymore. I was vibrating with the energy of a woman who was finally taking her life back. Julian's lawyer was there, looking exhausted and embarrassed, while Julian sat in the corner of the room, refusing to look at me. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that even the court clerk seemed to notice. The judge began to look through the evidence Marcus had prepared, her eyebrows rising higher with every page she flipped. She looked at Julian, then at me, and I knew in that moment that the finale was near. My heart raced, but it wasn't the racing of a victim. It was the racing of a victor. The ultimate reveal was coming, and I was the one holding the curtain. Inside the judge's chambers, the air felt thin and cold. Julian's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to my lawyer, then slid a piece of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a new settlement offer. Julian was offering me the house, both cars, and a significant cash sum, but there was a catch. The catch was a non-disclosure agreement that would force me to delete every photo, every spreadsheet, and every piece of evidence Marcus had found. He wanted to buy my silence so he could keep his job and his reputation with his father. I looked at the paper, then I looked at Julian. He was staring at me with pleading eyes, trying to look like the man I once loved. For a second, I thought about how easy it would be to just sign and walk away with a guaranteed future. I picked up the pen, but I didn't sign it. Instead, I wrote one word in big, bold letters across the top of the agreement. No. I slid it back to his lawyer while looking Julian straight in the eye. "You still think this is about the money, Julian?" I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "But you can't put a price on the truth. You tried to make me look like I was losing my mind to cover up your crimes. A house and a car aren't enough to pay for that." The judge watched us closely, her face unreadable. Julian's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. They realized then that I wasn't looking for a payoff. I was looking for a reckoning. The settlement was dead, and the full hearing was the only way forward. The morning of the final hearing, I woke up before my alarm. I stood in front of the mirror and put on a sharp navy blue suit that made me feel like armor. I didn't look like the tired, confused woman who had slammed her laptop shut in tears a few months ago. I looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side stronger. Rachel met me at the courthouse steps with a coffee and a hug. "You're ready, Frankie," she said. The numbers don't lie, and neither do you. We walked past a group of reporters who were there because word of the family fraud had finally leaked to the local business news. Julian arrived a few minutes later, looking pale and hiding behind his legal team. As I sat at the plaintiff's table, I opened my briefcase and pulled out the final case file Marcus had prepared. It was thick and heavy, containing every manipulated transaction and every fake invoice. I felt a strange sense of calm as the bailiff called the court to order. I looked over at the gallery and saw Julian's father sitting in the back row. He wasn't sitting with Julian. He was sitting alone, looking older than I had ever seen him. I realized then that Julian hadn't just lost me. He had lost everyone who actually cared about him. The power dynamic wasn't just shifting anymore. It had completely flipped. I was the one standing on solid ground, and Julian was the one standing on a crumbling cliff. My lawyer stood up and began the opening statement with a voice that filled the entire courtroom. He didn't use fancy legal words, he told a story. He told the story of a wife who trusted her husband and a husband who used that trust to build a secret kingdom of stolen wealth. He spoke about Golden Oak Ventures and the fake construction invoices. Every time he mentioned a specific dollar amount, he pointed to the large screen where we projected the evidence Marcus had found. I watched the judge's face as she saw the proof of Julian's forgery. She wasn't just listening. She was leaning forward, her eyes narrow and focused. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft whirring of the projector fan. When it was time for Julian's lawyer to speak, the energy in the room changed. He tried to argue that the accounts were complex investments that I simply didn't understand. He tried to bring up the smear campaign again, hinting that my evidence was the result of a disturbed mind. But every time he told a lie, the evidence on the screen stood there as a silent rebuttal. Julian sat with his head down, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He looked like a man who knew the end was coming. The arrogance that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp panic. I sat tall, my hands folded on the table, watching the ultimate reveal begin to unfold. I spent the entire night in my hotel room, surrounded by the final versions of the case files. Every single account, every shell company, and every manipulated transaction was now organized into a perfect, undeniable timeline. I double-checked every number, ensuring that the math was bulletproof. I knew that Julian would try to squirm out of the truth one last time, but I had built a cage of facts that he couldn't escape. The finale was finally near, and for the first time in months I didn't feel like a victim of a crime. I felt like the architect of a rescue mission for my own life. My heart raced as the sun began to rise over the city buildings, but it wasn't the racing of fear anymore. It was the pure anticipation of the truth finally being shouted from the rooftops. I looked at the Golden Oak file and realized that Julian's arrogance had been my greatest ally. He never thought I was smart enough to follow the breadcrumbs. As I dressed for the final day of court, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The ultimate reveal was coming, and I was the only one who knew exactly how hard the hammer was about to fall. I looked at the photo of the children on my nightstand and promised them that their future was finally safe. Julian had spent years trying to make me feel small and capable of nothing, but today I was the most powerful person in the room. I tucked the final forensic report into my briefcase and snapped the lock shut. The sound was sharp and final, like a gavel hitting a wooden desk. I was ready to walk into that courtroom and end the charade once and for all. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the moment the mask finally fell off the monster. In the courtroom, the documents dropped like a literal bombshell. When my lawyer handed the stack of forensic evidence to the judge and projected the offshore wire transfers onto the big screen, the entire room went silent. Gasps echoed through the gallery as the hidden accounts, shell companies, and siphoned funds were laid bare for everyone to see. I watched Julian's face carefully. His trademark smirk didn't just fade. It vanished instantly, replaced by a gray, sickly mask of pure panic. Every deception he had practiced for years was being publicly shattered in front of the judge, the public, and his own father. Every lie he had told about my mom brain or my instability was proven to be a desperate cover for his own greed. The courtroom was mine now, and I didn't win it with cruelty or shouting. I won it with cold, hard evidence and the dignity of a woman who refused to stay silent. The judge spent a long time looking at the fake invoices Julian had created. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of absolute disgust. She looked at Julian not as a successful executive, but as a common thief who had betrayed his family. I sat perfectly still, my back straight and my head held high. I didn't need to say a word because the numbers were screaming the truth for me. Julian's legal team tried to huddle together and whisper, but there was no defense left for what they were seeing. The Golden Oak Empire had crumbled into a pile of red ink and forged signatures. For the first time in my life, I felt the heavy weight of the last 10 years lift off my shoulders. The truth wasn't just a weapon, it was a cure. I turned around to look at the gallery, and the sight was something I will never forget. Julian's family, who had been so smug and dismissive at the Thanksgiving table and the mediation dinner, now recoiled from him as if he were poisonous. His sister wouldn't even look in his direction, and his mother was hiding her face in her hands. Allies who had supported his smear campaign against me were now whispering to each other, their faces filled with shock and scandal. The arrogance and manipulation that had defined Julian's entire personality had completely collapsed under the weight of his own choices. I watched silently, composed and calm, as justice unfolded in real time. My patience and my methodical approach had achieved what anger alone never could. I had dismantled his life using nothing but the truth he tried so hard to bury. Julian tried to stand up to say something, but his father put a hand on his shoulder and forced him back down into his seat. It wasn't a gesture of support, it was a gesture of shame. The man who had tried to leave me with nothing was now the one who had truly lost everything. His job was gone, his family's respect was gone, and his freedom was now in the hands of a judge who didn't like being lied to. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing him suffer. It was seeing him lose the ability to lie to anyone ever again. He was finally seen for exactly who he was, and the world was moving on without him. I stood up as the judge called for a recess, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a little girl. The war was over and I was the last one standing. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the fresh air that finally felt like it belonged to me. The judge's final ruling had been a total victory. Not only did I secure a fair settlement that protected my children's future, but the court also ordered Julian to pay back every single cent he had siphoned away, plus interest. He was no longer the untouchable executive. He was a man facing the consequences of his own greed. As I looked at the finalized divorce decree in my hand, I realized that the heavy weight I had carried for years was finally gone. I didn't feel the need to scream or brag. The silence of my success was the loudest message I could ever send. I had closed the chapter on a marriage built on lies and opened a new book where I was the only author of my story. Walking away from that life, I felt unburdened and stronger than I ever thought possible. The money and the restored dignity were important, but the real prize was the peace of mind I felt when I tucked my kids into bed that night. I didn't need to look over my shoulder or wonder if the floor was going to fall out from under me again. Julian's attempt to leave me with nothing had backfired so completely that he was the one starting over from scratch, while I was standing on a foundation of truth. My calm resilience and my refusal to back down had been my ultimate vindication. I emerged from the fire unbroken, victorious, and fully in control of my own destiny. I was Frankie Tate and I was finally beautifully free.